and very happy to be here with the distinguished panelists. And thank you all for attending, and thank you to all the young people who are here, part of the Youth Justice Network. Great to see you all. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the ICJ advisory opinion for anyone who doesn't yet know. Everyone should know. A group of young people, university students at the School of Law in the USP, of which MLS campus is one campus in Port Vila. We're given an assignment on what is the single legal measure that could make the most effect in addressing the climate change crisis we're in. And their answer was an advisory opinion from the ICJ. And of course, that has to be sponsored by states. It has to go through the UNGA. And so Vanuatu agreed to take that up. And with funding from FILE, and I have to say, without that funding, we wouldn't have gone anywhere. We were able to start a diplomatic campaign. Diplomatic level, lots of civil society, youth involvement in building awareness with states, to the point where in March this year, we got a historic unanimous vote in favor of sending the question to the ICJ. And yeah, first time ever there's been a unanimous referral of a question to the ICJ. So thank you to everyone who was part of that awareness raising and pushing at all levels to make this possible. I recognize the leadership of the young people especially. And also, I want to say we acknowledge the core group that we developed within New York, the countries, the 18 countries that came together to work with Vanuatu to make sure that when the question was put before the General Assembly, all areas of the world had given their inputs and were ready to support. And that was a very successful diplomatic strategy. So the resolution that is now being considered by that will be considered by the ICJ, there's two key issues. The first is for the ICJ to clarify the legal obligations of states to protect the climate system based on existing international law. And that's all international instruments that states have signed and the framework of international law which exists under the United Nations. And the second is for the ICJ to advise on the legal consequences associated with states' willful acts to breach their obligations under international law. So those two questions are the ones that are going before the court. We are still open for submissions to the court by January. Many countries and organizations have applied and have been accepted to make submissions. We are, of course, expecting submissions against a strong opinion, saying states don't have obligations and there's no consequences for breaching international law or conventions that you've signed. So it is a adversarial situation we're going into. And as the minister, I just want to appeal to all SIDS and countries that are affected. I want to see a very strong advisory opinion in favor of states' obligations to please make submissions. And the team here can, if there's anyone here who's from a state or that does want to make a submission. We're here to talk about coordination. So we need to coordinate on support if people need support. We need to coordinate on arguments to go before the court. We need to coordinate on different elements to support the aligned states, how we're going to present evidence and so on. Basically, we need to conspire to get the best outcome, those of us who are wanting to see a good outcome from the court. And of course, there's a long process ahead of us, submissions and then arguments and so on, bringing witnesses and so on. So the purpose of this event is to talk about how we're trying to coordinate our submissions to the ICJ. Thank you.
Thank you too much, Honorable Minister, for setting a scene, and especially highlighting how we can collaborate, how we can work together to make a very strong submission with the ICJ. And it's also good to see that the young people are taking the lead in addressing most of this issue, because we are more concerned with what the generations that are coming behind. We have our next panelist this morning, Mrs. Crystal Bratt. Mrs. Crystal Bratt has served as the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, Assistant Secretary General, Environment and Climate since late 2020. She has also served as the Pacific Islands Forum Deputy Secretary General from 2014 to 2020, and headed SOPAC, now a division of the SPC. From 2004 to 2010, she is a marine scientist and has committed her professional career to sustainability and resilience agendas. Thank you, Mrs. Pratt. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator, and good morning, Honourable Minister, distinguished panellists, and all those that have turned out to join us this morning in this side event. I think the Minister has really eloquently outlined the reason why we're here, and the reason why we do need to coordinate our efforts, not just for those here in the room and for present generations, but also for future generations in terms of how we engage with the ICJ. But why have I been invited to this panel, you will ask? The Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States is made up of 79 member countries, all developing countries, all vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. And as a consequence, in July of last year, our Council of Ministers determined that they would support the Vanuatu-led campaign for a UN General Assembly resolution on the obligation of states with respect to climate change. And so that was the first decision that they took. They took 2 further ministerial decisions, and the most recent one last July, so a few months ago, and determined that the OACPS itself would approach the court to make a statement and engage in the proceedings, but also encouraged other regional organisations as well as member states of the OACPS to also actively engage. As part of their last decision, they, aside from that part, they also encouraged the holding of right shops. And again, I think a nod to FILE, because we are and have been working with FILE to see how we can provide support to developing states, developing countries that really need to be heard in the ICJ. And I think, as the Honourable Minister did mention, there will be both those that will need to write strong submissions, and there would be some adversarial submissions that we would need to counter. And so in that regard, we have worked closely with the African Union Commission and the CARICOM to hold right shops in the Caribbean and African regions, and the Pacific, through the Pacific community through SPC, have held already 2 right shops. I'm telling you this and at a time when, and I think as the Minister said, the timeline is the 22nd of January 2024. So that does sound a long way away. However, it is just a little more than 6 weeks away. And so just as we're running out of time in terms of addressing the climate crisis, we're also running out of time in terms of making those written statements. And so part of our coordination has been to see how various international organisations and member states can write to the ICJ registrar to request for a further extension of at least 4 months, which will allow member states and international organisations to engage, to make written statements, and then as well as that to engage in the proceedings. The OACPS has already written to the ICJ registrar. That letter was sent last week, and I understand that other international organisations will be doing the same if not already, in the next days. We're also organising a collective letter, a letter that will be signed by states, their permanent representatives in Brussels, to be conveyed through to the ICJ registrar. And we feel that it is important that coordination is happening in Brussels, where we are headquartered, but we would encourage any member states that are here today that are confronting similar sorts of challenges, but realise the absolute importance of this initiative. And congratulations to Vanuatu for not only leading it, but staying unbelievably committed and showing such leadership on an action that will make a difference, which will definitely make a difference to diplomacy, to the way in which we address this issue legally and in the courts in the future. And so my plug today was really very much on showing that coordination is important leading up to the submissions. And then I think, as the Minister said, how we tactically work closely together throughout the proceedings to get a strong advisory opinion on climate change as soon as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Pratt. I think coordination is also another important part of the process that we are following, and you have highlighted that, and thank you for supporting Vanuatu and the member countries in taking this initiative through. We, ladies and gentlemen, we will now have our next panelist, Mr. Carol Mavat. Mr. Carol Mavat is the president and CEO of a Center of International Environment Law. Prior to joining CIEL, Carol served as Executive Director of Climate Law and Policy. And we also have Laura Clark, Mrs. Laura Clark. They will be sharing some of the experience this morning on how we'll be going through the process. And I guess for most of the Pacific Island countries, this is a first-time process that we are taking the lead on, and we need the legal support to provide us the processes on what should we do in submissions. How can a country have a strong submission to submit to the International Court of Justice? So we have Carol and Laura to clarify some of this process and how we have gone far with this ICJ initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to start all by acknowledging the Pacific students for their leadership on this. The Minister and Vanuatu for their determined leadership on all aspects of the response to the climate crisis, to all the countries that have supported this initiative and filed for their incredible support. And I think this is an incredible legal initiative, but also a movement that has been built up. And I think that's so important. I'll start, if I can, just by a couple of words about me and then about Client Earth and what has driven me to this work and Client Earth. I mean, I spent a long time in government, in diplomacy, and I spent 4.5 years as British High Commissioner to New Zealand, British High Commissioner to Samoa, and the governor of the Pitcairn Islands. And in the course of that work, I joined meetings of the Pacific community several times. And even though throughout my career I'd worked extensively on climate and environmental issues, it was spending time in the South Pacific, getting to know Pacific communities and leaders, that I really became determined that I needed to devote my career to these issues full time, because it is an existential challenge for Pacific Island communities. It is a day-to-day reality, and I'm in such admiration of the leadership provided by all those in the region. And as Client Earth, our we see the law as an incredibly powerful tool to drive the change that we need to see. We think that if you bring legal interventions at the right time, you can get to those positive tipping points in terms of our ability to adapt and live more in balance with the world. So whether you get the right laws in place, whether you bring litigation at the right time, it can really transform our approach, and it can particularly change mindsets and decision makers of governments, of businesses, to really lean into the transition. So we've had a huge focus on environmental justice and the human rights obligation on governments to take action on climate change, whether that's the case that we supported with Torres Strait Islanders to the UN Human Rights Committee, saying that the Australian government's inaction on climate change was a violation of their human rights and their right to culture, or whether it's a number of cases that we've brought on clean air and really trying to underline that human right to a healthy environment. And so it was only right that we then got engaged with this initiative. But I want to stress that as Client Earth, we're very much in a supporting role. But we really wanted to get engaged on this initiative because we see it's incredibly powerful if we can get an advisory opinion that absolutely clarifies the obligations of states to deliver on their Paris agreements, to address climate impacts, address the impact on human rights and on the rights of current and future generations. That's incredibly important in terms of the pressure that drives on the and the ambition and action that can be delivered. So we have worked very much to support this initiative, to engage with states on their submissions, but also calling much more widely, ensuring that states, as they make their submissions, they're putting in very strong submissions with strong legal arguments, but they're also making sure that they're reflecting the views, the voices, the experiences and perspectives of much broader society, of civil society, of young people, of indigenous communities, because it's critical, because the ICJ process, of course, between states, it's critical that states engage very widely. And that's why it's so important that this is not just a legal initiative, it is a movement. And so the World's Youth for Climate Justice playing such an important part in support of the Pacific students movement, really important to really raise the volume on this, and therefore raise the pressure on states to engage in a way that is not defensive, that is not thinking about their own interests and the challenges of mitigation, but is making them think about the collective interests of our planet and the interests of future generations. So I really want to, we are doing all we can to support those efforts, providing legal expertise, providing support and supporting also the movement. So I just want to close by coming back and saying congratulations to everyone involved. It's an incredibly important and empowering movement that I think has really captured the imagination. And that's what we need. We need the laws to bring the change we need, but we also need to work with hearts and minds and capture the imagination and the excitement of people to see that change is possible. And we can bring pressure from below as movements, and we can bring pressure from above from these international courts. And that's what this is about. It's about coordinated action at scale in this critical decade. Thank you.
I am Carol Muffett. I'm with the Center for International Environmental Law. We have worked for more than 30 years at the intersection of human rights and environment, and we have worked on the human rights implications of climate change for that entire 30+ year history. And so for that reason, I think we are particularly excited and particularly appreciative for both the leadership of the Pacific students and youth, and particularly the leadership of Vanuatu and the minister personally in shepherding this process through the UNGA, and now and critically shepherding it before the International Court of Justice. This is truly a generational opportunity. And I want to emphasize what that means. When we think about how to engage in this process, we cannot think about now. We have to think about the way in which the law works, the submissions that are made here, the opinions, the concurring opinions, the dissents that come out of the other side of this process will establish the foundations for the development of the law in this space for a generation to come. And that is the gravity with which we need to view it. And that is precisely why the calls for coordination among states are so vitally important. I think, and this is why, again, we would encourage all states not only to engage and engage very actively, but to work closely with Vanuatu, with Blue Ocean Law, and with other alliances of states who are coordinating their efforts to ensure we take full advantage of this opportunity and understand the challenges. And I want to speak to the most fundamental of those challenges, because certainly there will be a small handful of states who simply say there are no responsibilities at all. The greater danger by far in this process, and we've seen it in the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea and other similar initiatives that are ongoing right now, is those states, including many that consider themselves progressive, who will say, oh yes, there is relevant international law. It's called the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. That is the greatest legal danger in this process, is that you allow a small number of states to say that the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC define the standard of care by which states' duties to other states, to present generations and future generations are defined. So I think what is really critical in these processes is that we ensure that there are memorials going in from states that speak to the responsibilities of states to avoid transboundary harm, the responsibilities of states for human rights, not only for their own citizens, but for human rights impacts beyond their boundaries. The duty of states to regulate the conduct of actors within, non-state actors within their borders, to ensure that we are speaking to the responsibility of states to regulate corporate conduct that is driving the climate crisis. We need memorials to draw heavily, not only on those principles, but on the extensive work that the International Law Commission has done on international principles with respect to atmospheric pollution. The work of the International Law Commission on the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. That goes far beyond the standards that are defined by the Paris Agreement, which are profoundly bottom-up and profoundly weak. This is where that coordination is key. I think one of the temptations will be for states to present documentary evidence of how they are affected by the climate crisis. And that evidence, make no mistake, is extraordinarily important. It is valuable to build out that record. But in an advisory opinion process, this is not a case on the merits. The ICJ is not adjudicating an active dispute between two countries. Instead, what it is settling are fundamental underlying questions of law. And so what we would really encourage is that memorials that states develop, yes, absolutely recognize that factual context, proffer the evidence, but focused most heavily on the underlying law. And to do this effectively, states will absolutely need to coordinate. It is much more effective to have multiple memorials, each of them going very deep on a substantive area and cross-referencing each other, rather than having many memorials and inputs from states, all of which basically say the same thing at a comparatively shallow level. And I can guarantee you that states on the other side of this issue, states that are seeking to avoid responsibility, are thinking of it in that way. The last thing that I want to say before I conclude is that beyond the legal resources that we've highlighted, and recognizing the leadership of the youth and students that have brought us to this extraordinary moment. There is a unique responsibility and a unique opportunity to build into these memorials an explicit discussion of the duties of states to future generations. And this is where there is an opportunity to draw on the raft of recent authoritative statements that have emerged with respect to the rights of future generations, including the Maastricht Principles on the Rights of Future Generations, which were launched this summer. And I'll just highlight, there is extensive and authoritative legal research underlying those principles that we would love to see rolled into memorials. I will conclude there. I do want to offer a last thought, particularly for Indigenous peoples in this room. One final extraordinary opportunity in this ICJ process is for Indigenous peoples to submit inputs in their own right to the ICJ as autonomous entities, and to confront the ICJ for the first time with the fact that it has never grappled with that question of the sovereignty of Indigenous communities. This is an extraordinary opportunity not only to advance the law of climate change, but to advance the tenure and sovereignty and responsibility of Indigenous peoples around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mavat and Laura, for giving your insights. You've been reflecting strong submissions from the countries, and especially taking the evidence from the communities. It has to be a strong evidence that is affecting people from the indigenous in communities. And this is something that we really want to see in our submission, and also the responsibility of state. You have really highlighted that. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, our last panelist member is Siosiua Veikune. He's a very young guy here, a very young expert from the Pacific, from the Kingdom of Tonga. Please give him a round of applause. He joined the PISFCC back in 2019, an effort to meaningfully contribute to the fight for climate justice. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Porque eu vou tentar dar up course na faki. Tamo que fai aqui fahoa. Thank you very much. Intimidating sitting amongst my fellow panelists today. So if I do mess up, my apologies. From the CSO front, two concepts have always remained at the core of our campaigning, and that is human rights and intergenerational equity. We had campaigned for this since 2019. These two concepts are reflected in the legal question that was unanimously adopted earlier this year, and we intend to continue this consistency through the state submissions phase to ensure that the resulting advisory opinion includes these two concepts. By approaching from a human rights perspective, we are literally putting people at the core and at the forefront of the solution to the climate crisis. Human rights law allows for more ambitious climate action because it provides a more comprehensive perspective of state obligations. We are spearheading a few initiatives to assist us with these goals. One of which is through evidence gathering. Now, very early on in the campaign, we had discussed the use of the inclusion of climate stories in state submissions. And following the unanimous adoption earlier this year, we were informed that this can be done by through testimonies or attachments to the state submissions. Legal arguments are expected to address the obligations of states with regards to climate change, and scientific evidence should be used to ground or solidify these legal arguments in fact. And the intention for these witness statements is to provide a much needed context that will anchor both the legal arguments and the scientific evidence with the lived realities of frontline communities. We are working through our network of CSOs to reach out to their respective governments and offer their assistance, and to make clear that the ICJO campaign has fostered a unique government and CSO model for collaboration. Because we are not seeking to work against our governments in this instance, but rather alongside them to support them with their state submissions. There is great effort in working through your local CSOs because, if anything, this campaign has shown that when given the chance and with the proper preparation and planning, CSOs and youth movements are able to exact change and address the climate crisis meaningfully. And in the instance of Global South countries, it is crucial that the voices of your people are taken to the ICJ because they are the frontline communities of the climate crisis. It must be understood that these witness statements are our efforts to show that in reality, we are not foreseeing a near future of climate crisis, but rather we are living it in this present day. We have also, through our advocacy, been encouraging governments to involve their youths and CSOs in answering a portion of the legal question, which addresses future generations specifically and state obligations to these future generations. Consult your youths, consult your CSOs so that your state submissions are inclusive of all voices. Who better to speak for our future generations than our current, who better to speak for our future youths than our current youths today? It was mentioned by my fellow panelists today, but it is worth reiterating that this is a unique and historic opportunity for states to take part of shaping development of international law, especially from a human rights perspective. Never before has the ICJ spoken on the issue of climate change, and we are at an impasse. And for too long, we have been in a cycle, reliving a cycle of inaction, which demands an approach that is both radical, whilst also strengthening existing frameworks. This advisory proceeding does not seek to replace existing mechanisms, such as the UNFCCC frameworks or the Paris Agreement, but rather to strengthen these existing frameworks with the legal clarity provided by a very strong advisory opinion. The ICJAO campaign does have its alliance members, and they are constantly at the ready with their global network and support mechanisms to ensure that we can assist states, eager states, with their submissions, whether it is through expert reports or assistance with drafting your state submissions or with capturing your witness statements. We are constantly at the ready. I would like to also mention that we're also running a media strategy campaign that is very similar to the witness statement. Our current working title is a witness stand, not to be confused with the witness statement. And it is basically us capturing answers of everyday people to the prompt or to the question of what is your message to the International Court of Justice. Now, this is not intended to be part of the ICJ proceeding, but rather as an advocacy tool to strengthen the momentum of the campaign, firstly, whilst also allowing the common folk to be heard, to have their stories told. So please, if any and all are welcome to reach out to us. Now, even though it started as a Pacific Youth Initiative 4 years ago in 2019 in Vanuatu, today it is international, and it requires global effort to ensure its success. And this means the inclusion and consultation of youths in the drafting process. This means having progressive and ambitious legal arguments. This means arguing for human rights and intergenerational equity in your state submissions. As mentioned by the Honorable Minister and Christelle earlier, there will be detractors at the ICJ, but we are many. We cannot bring the ICJ to the We cannot bring the ICJ to the frontline communities. So we will take the frontline communities to the ICJ. No matter that.
Thank you so much, Mr. CEO, for your insights. And also it's good to see young people are taking the initiative in this, putting theory into perspective, into practical, and taking the lead. You've highlighted the partnership and strong collaboration between the CSO and the government to work together in this initiative, and that's really good. That's what we want to see as we are working together to address this very important issue. Ladies and gentlemen, apologize for the noise, but I guess you have been sitting and listening. You have all the expertise here with you. If you have any question or comments, the floor is yours now to raise any question or comments. Thank you, this one. If you can introduce yourself, please, and ask your question.
Okay, thanks. I'm Daniel Eggleston from the International Development Law Organization based in The Hague. So my question is kind of inspired by something that Carol, I think, mentioned on the need for memorials to coordinate approaches and ensure that there's kind of a solid and united front on the interpretation. I was just wondering how you ensure this in practice, because you can approach this issue from so many different ways. From international human rights law, customary law, intergenerational equity, aspects of private international law. How are you ensuring that, you know, there is this united front in the memorials and coordinating on this? Thanks.
Is the question clear or?
Yeah,
okay.
as I understood, the question was that there are many different ways to approach these issues, and obviously many lenses of law in addition to many areas of law. How do you, how can you actually coordinate? And I think the best answer that I can offer is to start with Vanuatu and start with Blue Ocean law, and the regional councils and bodies that are already working together is one of the best ways to do that. Because bear in mind that absolutely, those regional councils can and Vanuatu and Blue Ocean law help states think about the collective memorials that they provide input through, but the opportunities to provide individual memorials that speak to individual issues and in a deeper way. So
I think we have very good coordination team with Blue Ocean Law and their network. And I suppose our concern is the slowness of states. And as the time is ticking and we need very good arguments, we are hoping that these kind of events and of course your advocacy will push states to step up, make the decision to do this, and then they can engage with this network of legal networks around the world, which are really, we're very happy with the support given by the international legal networks to assist states and work with each other. So I think the coordination is not so much the issue as we need states and other parties who are going to make submissions to really fast track the time frame.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. Is there any? Yes, behind. We have one from the back. Introduce yourself, please.
Thank you. This is the Palam Srestha from Nepal, environment lawyer. I want to say something, especially environment lawyer. So Nepal, 33% Himalayan, mountain also there, Everest also there, but lot of climate change issue there, but not emission from Nepal. So Nepal has given lot of law making process related to environment justice. So Supreme Court of Nepal also decided climate change justice. So I want to say it is a difficult and facing lot of issue in Nepal. I want to give one paper. This is the Supreme Court decision and distribute for all. Thank you.
Thank you, our friend from Nepal. There's another one from here.
Thank you. I'm Laura from File Foundation. So I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for the comments by the panel and to share what a privilege it has been for File to be able to work alongside Pacific Youth and alongside Vanuatu and Blue Ocean Law for the years of work that has gone into this initiative, and just to really commend the effectiveness of the work that's being done by those parties and the leadership that they've shown to this date, and the faith that we have in their strategic leadership going through this process now. And just how important it is, as the panel have said, that this is not just about the law, this is a movement built around a legal initiative. So fullest participation and voice, and those frontline communities speaking and having that opportunity to stand in this process is so incredibly important. So just to underline that this is a generational opportunity, and the way that we do this and how we stand in unity will really determine how we can deploy this over the next years. So just a huge thank you from File to Vanuatu, to Pacific Youth and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I give 2 minutes to anyone from the panelists to say a last word or something before we can finish. I know we have 2 to 3 minutes or 2 minutes.
I've just received a nudge from the Honourable Minister to perhaps just reinforce or repeat part of my intervention, and that is, to really encourage a bit of momentum as well behind requesting an extension to the ICJ registrar, an extension beyond the 22nd of January 2024, which is no more than 6 weeks away. I think for all of us to participate in a very robust and concrete way, which will be extremely important, many developing countries need more time. And so I hope that you'll join with us in making a collective effort for that second extension that we're seeking from the ICJ. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. And we look forward for a strong submission from the states to support this initiative.